particular to Morong actually. Apo Alipon is believed, at least in Morong, to be one of the first Aytas in Bataan who traveled. Based on different sources, some say he traveled from Zambales and some say he traveled all the way from Visayas via boat. Pero so him and his wife, Lola Moray, they have descendants, and then when he was old, he called on his descendants to go to the river, wherein he did this gesture of putting his hand by the river, which is called Kanao, and then the river is now called Kanawan River. And then he told his descendants that, you, my descendants, this is what we will do in the near future. We will love one another, take care of one another, respect one another, take care of the nature, take care of the land, plant on it, nurture it, and treat it as community property. That particular quote I had also translated into that installation over there, and the original text is in Magbukun dialect. Okay, so I just wanted to start with this image when you come from downstairs. Sige.
What is the dialect again? Magbukun.
Okay, so where are we now? So I guess from here we go to that via the quote. And within this whole context of the origin story, there is a recurrent gesture of listing down objects that they would bring from in their travels. So for example, they would have the big pot from their ancestor, or bolo from the ancestor, or friction stones, or other herbs and root crops that they would consume in the travels. So
Travels as nomadic people across the peninsula.
Yeah. Because traditionally they would be hunter-gatherers and then nomadic. So after they would consume the game in a particular area, they would move to another and then let it regenerate, basically. So agriculture is not exactly one of their most prime practices. So this installation is entitled Palyon, Kahapon, Ngayon, at Mamaya. Palyon is the referencing to the sacred site, which is in the forest, and then they would go there to sort of reconnect with their ancestors, or the anitos, who they hold in high regard. So my interpretation of the particular objects within their travels, for example, in the big pot from ancestors, was reiterated into the ceramic heads representing ancestors, and bolos are reiterated as sickles because they are now mostly farm workers and slowly becoming agriculturalists because they have settled in the reservations. And the friction stones have reiterated in my invented concrete anting-antings, which if you look closely, may details talaga on. So, may mga ganyan. Tapos, na like may uring manggagawa kung mapagpalaya, or uring magsasaka, and so on and so forth.
Uring magsasaka.
Yeah.
Amulets.
So I guess in the spirit of this pre-walkthrough for you guys, maybe we can also mention that, like I said, like my trail of thought in the residency, while I was trying to think of what to do in terms of research, and I was finding narratives to explore, I realized that the history in Bataan was about Japanese occupation in World War II, and then eventually I had gravitated into the narrative of the IPs and the Aytas in Bataan. So, you know how the research went? Do I have to explain to the others?
Yeah, please.
Yeah? Okay, sige. So I had started the research with like an on-the-surface view of what was there, whatever information was there about Aytas in Bataan, because most of the information was about Zambales and Pinatubo. There was not much literature about the ones in Bataan, except save only for a few, like a handful, relatively contemporary researches. So,
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So you mean that the general consciousness of the or like, the general, how do you say, like parang yung consciousness natin of Aytas was brought about from the Pinatubo explosion. Parang before that there wasn't that much.
Well, depends on
popular...
what one means when you say general consciousness, because we were taught in school na yung wave migration theory, na yung early settlers of the Philippines was the Aytas, and then the Indones, and then the Malays. And that's authored by an American historian, Henry Audley Bayer, who has no basis whatsoever for that claim. And he did not even write it. It was a comic drawn by a young Manansala. And then that information was turned over to American education, which we are still taking now, and is actually very racist and wrong and has no ethno-linguistic and archaeological evidence. So, if anything, what is relatively more safe to say is that we are all related via our language, our Austronesian-speaking language. But then that's also one theory out of a few. So in terms of our consciousness of the Aytas, it's a hodgepodge of different readings on who these Aborigines are, or who these indigenous communities are, and also goes to show on how we constantly view other cultures with colonial eyes. So, for example, in the practice of ethnography, there's always the idea of being an ethnographer from a different culture, or being an ethnographer within your own culture, and practicing this trail of thought, this mode of questioning via the practice of yung research methodologies of ethnography and anthropology and historical readings. So I have just gathered like a lot of literature about them in particular, and about other Ayta communities from Pinatubo, Zambales, and Sierra Madre, and Palawan, and so on and so forth, as comparative literature. Because, comparative literature. And then on the other side, I collected literature about policies and legal laws concerning IP struggles and land ownership. Also, a few pieces of literature about colonial photography, which I will show you isn't here, Diana. So
let's find the page. This particular...
Sige. So this is actually a thesis by Christopher Copozola about the photographer Dean Worcester, because he was one of the most prominent photographers. He's not actually an ethnographer or a historian. He's trained as a botanist, but he just happened to have a camera and like the fetish of exotic women.
Wow.
So obviously these women weren't standing or acting like this, they're posed.
Yeah.
Can we dog ear that?
Yeah. And so what's also very interesting is to see here how, if you zoom in on these images, how they're treated as objects.
Yeah. So this is the view that we're trying to go against also. They are not subjects, they're not objects. Also, Dean Worcester has his own National Geographic issue, which is here, which has most of this in it. So some are like legal texts and like more other than ethnographic social science readings, and some are colonial ethnographies, like this one from 1857, the French, and then Los Itas from Pedro Paterno, 1800s and late 1800s. Yeah.
Danger Do Not Operate is a manual.
Yeah, Danger Do Not Operate is a collaboration between myself and Alisa and Efren a little bit. So yeah, it's funny.
Can I see it?
Danger Do Not Operate. So I had asked Alisa, the research assistant, to compile me like an on-the-surface reading, like anything in public domain sources, everything about, or a lot of whatever about the Bataan Nuclear Power Plant, Military Industrial Complex in Hermosa.
Oh,
and
this is the, I remember
this is this project, and Bataan Export Processing Zone. And then I had entitled it Danger Do Not Operate, and then the caption is particular cases of aggressive neoliberal development in the peninsula. So I just wanted it like as a small project inserted in the colonial case legal base.
Inserted.
So other than Alisa's reports, which is pretty in-depth actually, I had just gathered a lot of online articles about coal plants and logging and the National Greening Project, whatever there is mining in the peninsula, and generally land grabbing. So yeah. No, this is, these are reports lang din.
Super cool.
Yeah,
Cool.
it's fun.
Good to know. Because I was like,
What is this? Yeah.
Yeah.
So Danger Do Not Operate, I got the title from a little tag we stole from the Bataan nuclear power plant.
steal.
I borrowed.
Can't steal here. Off the record, Raymond.
I'll edit it out. I'll bleep it out.
One other thing that I think is interesting is the last installation in the show, how this foils this section, even in the format with the rows. But so here the Aytas are treated as objects. They're kind of fetishized for a way of life that's imagined by the photographer. But what Cian did by giving them the disposable cameras, they're basically chronicling themselves the way they want to be seen as a living culture in the 21st century. So I think that was a really nice gesture. So when you get to that section, it's interesting to tie it back here.
Yeah. Okay, keyword policy. So this is just my little artistic interpretation, reflecting on one of their modes of income, which is charcoal production. They do it in rainy season, and every once in a while, local government would ban charcoal production and set up checkpoints, and then this is actually something that they feel strongly about. So this charred image of a right-wing verdugo is my idea, trying to mix charcoal production and productivity with the idea of burning an effigy and ritual humiliation of right-wing fascist. So actually, in my integration with the communities, there's not much mention of any political or militant or mass movement. So if anything, I have little inputs on how they having different readings on little pockets of resistance within their local history, which I will also explain when we look at the timeline of it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
The other important point for this section is that most of these texts have not been shared with the Ayta communities before. So people come in, they spend time, they leave, and no one sees what the outcome is. So what was interesting with Cian's 8 months of engaging with them is that he's actually shown these texts to them, and in the end this collection will be donated back to the community. So it's that kind of making the guest accountable for their time.
So we can take this wall from left to right.
Yeah, left to right.
Yeah. Basically, cartography has always been a big part of my artistic practice, and looking into the maps as potent infographics for information about geopolitical issues and boundaries and territories and whatnot. So I wanted to start with scientific maps, looking, or if anything, understanding the landscape via its soil composition and resources and its topography in very pragmatic, practical, and straightforward scientific ways on understanding the horizon, if you will. And then if you go on a little closer, a little more social construct narratives of history and other historical events. So a Commonwealth map of Bataan, and one example of the Japanese occupation map. And then moving on to the right are clusters taken from military handbook from the Allied Geographic Terrain Handbook of Zambales and Bataan. So if anything, I like the idea of, not that I like the idea, but then I think it's important to look at the military function of a map as a practical application of all these informations into more politicized readings and uses.
It's interesting. Can you speak about this section, for example, and how they were part of one handbook?
Okay, sige.
Yeah.
So the handbook is actually this small. This is the actual size, and these are all actual sizes. So these big maps came folded within that little handbook. So as you can see, the size itself and the format of a handbook is is very distinct for military use at the time. Something easy to pocket, something easy to bring, loaded with useful information in terms of maneuvering yourself within the rough terrain of the peninsula. So it's quite a variation of information placed in the shape of the landform, from the vegetation map to various resources and minerals which they can mine from the area, coastal maps and airfield maps, and the physiography or the population density. Okay, with the military, any questions? No? Alright. So this little cluster here are maps taken from various ethnographies about the Aytas, but of Pinatubo and Zambales. And then two maps here are diagrams of Aytas within the Philippine archipelago. So if you can see here, there are no labels, but in here, the Ambala and the Magbukun of Bataan are mentioned. Here in this little diagram naman, like all related, genetically and ethno-linguistically related indigenous groups within Southeast Asia, Australia, etc., and the Philippines. So having been presenting scientific, historical, military, and ethnographic readings of the space, we move on to my interpretation of the peninsula. So this is my map of the Aytas in Bataan, sort of trying to plot out the 18 communities of Bataan. I don't know if it's self-repeating.
And is known and celebrated in these tapestries, so this is a continuation in those series, and a lot of the tapestries are different kinds of maps. So maybe you can talk about how this one is different. It's your newest one, and how it's different from the ones you've done before.
Okay, so this is done in close consultation also with representatives from the community, which are, they're around also. Yeah. So I guess I just wanted to present like a representation of the peninsula with them in the forefront, them as the main subject matter. So if anything, the title and main text here is that it's the lupang ninuno of the Aytas sa Bataan. So it's just the domain of the land of the Aytas in Bataan. And then you can see here the names of the Ambala and the Magbukun. 6 of the 18 communities are Ambala and 12 are Magbukun. And then in the text, there is in the cartouche text, I had written it in English and then had it translated in Old Tagalog. And then, should I read? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, sige. I don't know how you guys are gonna... sige. Tinatala ng mapang ito ang mga kanayunan ng tribong Ambala at Magbukun sa Bataan. Sa buong kasaysayan, ang kanilang representasyon ay nabahira ng tinging kolonyal habang lalo silang tinutulak sa mas malayong lupain at napipilitang mabuhay sa lalayan ng lipunan. Nawa ay makatulong ang mapang ito sa kanilang pakikibaka sa pagkabuhay at pamamahala. Matantunawa natin na marami tayong matututunan sa kanila higit pa sa ating inaamin at nauunawaan. Matantunawa natin na ang dugong nananalaytay sa kanila ay tulad din ng sa atin. Cian Dayrit Unat. Unat referring to non-Ayta because they refer to themselves as kulot or curly hair. So yeah. I guess also important to note that when I was consulting with the communities or members of the communities about this particular map, I had brought it in some of the meetings. And then when I had referred to myself as Unat, there was a little a change or a sigh of relief, knowing that I knew my place as an Unat and not like as someone really wanting to be part of the community. I know the scopes and limitations of my integration and my time with the communities. And I am not trained as an ethnographer, I am a painter. Doing a lot of stuff I don't know what to do. So it's a crash course on a lot of stuff.
And I think it was also interesting, the conversation you had with them about how you weren't here to make money from them, right? Like that discussion, like, sometimes, that there's certain, know, if you're selling these ethnographic postcards or things like that, their image is used to benefit someone else commercially. So I think, you know, that explanation or that kind of mediation you had that, you know, this was a community-based project, not a selling project, and that it was one to tell their stories, you also saw a shift in the...
I think it's one of the most important things to talk about when directly integrating with a very particular proposal or project in mind coming from an academic point of view or an NGO point of view, because they need to know if you're going to make money out of this connection that you're making. And with art, you may or you may not. So it depends on your agreement. And I guess this relationship that we have been trying to develop as well is born out of a series of visits and exchanges, trying to draft this document of consent that we have finally agreed upon and signed, and is also hanging there.
And I think also the fact that you really wanted their input in your creative process, right? So they were able to draw their own maps. We have images in there of him laying the map out, or laying the map out for people to give their input. It was very much a collaborative process.
One of the activities we did was a counter mapping workshop. So they want to see it.
Does anyone have any questions? You have questions?
About the one that in Colon where
okay, yeah. Sige. So this is a workshop module which I've throughout the months been trying to develop. So I did a practice with them, one session. So counter cartography as opposed to cartography being always been authored by the state or authored from positions of power, because to draw lines of territory and boundary between within the representations of geological space is a very political gesture, and man is a very political animal. So counter cartography is actually a response to that notion of being in a position of power, wherein people who are the subjects of these maps, these documents, these political gestures are the ones authoring their own physical representation, the spatial representation. So this is a workshop I had conducted with some of the members of the communities, wherein I had asked them from blank pieces of paper to draw their general idea of their space, where they live, where they work, where experiences have happened, negative or positive, where confrontation has happened with armed groups, if you will, and where the disputed lands are, where the lands that were sold off, and to who and when and whatnot.
Also personal accounts, right?
And also very, very personal accounts, like details. May pangyayari na nilusog ako sa bahay at gusto ko kong patayin ni, and so on and so forth. Pero diba, it's a ha-ha, hu-hu. Like.
But there's truth in all humor. Humor is a fantastic tool to deal with these things.
Okay, so maybe we can move on to this. This is...
One thing I like to kind of do the maps, which you can decide whether you want to or not, is that foreigners are always kind of classifying the Aytas as a character that they encounter, and you flip that in this, you flip that power dynamic in this work.
Yeah. Okay, so this is actually one of the first series I did in the residency. These are masks of my idea of the characters within their colonial historical narrative. So if you go from like left to right, I wanted to start with the lumong. This is like the tikbalang, their version of the tikbalang, except instead of a horse head, it's a beehive head. But then it's not a hostile entity. It's just like a forest dweller kind of entity. So I wanted to start with this guy in particular because I wanted to start with the idea of with a personification of folk belief, the idea of primordiality and uncolonized thought. And then we move on to a character that's you don't know is hostile or not. They are classified historically as Sanglis, which is epistemologically referenced to Changli, which meant always come. So traditionally they are known as the Chinese merchants, but then they could also be Chinese raiders and pirates. So it's not always a beneficial exchange. And then we move on to the Praile character, who we all know, like colonize with a cross and indoctrinate. And then the conquistador, who we also all know, the firepower of the Praile, and the American soldier and whatever connotation that brings you personally. And then the image of an Ayta with fish in his hair. And then as a little anecdote, like there are several ethnographic accounts of Aytas being employed by American soldiers to gather forest produce like rattan and whatever fruit. And then after a hard day's work, they would be paid with a can of sardines. And then they would not know what this can of sardines would mean if it was a like good pat in the back or like yan ka lang. So after they had this is data from a few different sources and not particular to Bataan. So after they had consumed the sardines, they would use the sardine sauce to smear in their head as a sort of perfume, and then they would go to the houses or the families of the or the in-laws to sort of to take pride in the sweet smell of success. Yeah. And then the Japanese soldier, because like I had to mention Japan because of the Bataan local history. And then the three here at the last are my sort of personified take on various issues, colonial to contemporary, from deforestation to the energy crisis and the coal plant threats, and also the nuclear plant threat in Bataan, and overdevelopment. There.
So one of the things, this also is kind of like a fun one, right? Because you're going chronologically in the sense of the order of when these encounters happen.
So maybe also an important, maybe I'll just talk in general about the three sculptures here. So I had some done in this format, the like relatively small kind of diorama feel, museum scale, if you will. And this particular photograph, I was very much interested because I found in the Lopez archives, and then the idea of Aytas in the sea are totally alien and completely forgotten to them, or well, depends. Maybe we can consult with them later. But then just goes to show that historically they occupied lands not just in the mountains, also in the lowlands, and they were maybe seafarers, or at least they fished in the sea. So the idea of them being literally and historically pushed further up, and then up to today, sociologically, maybe we can still understand that their gaze, same as with our gaze, is to the sea. Maybe. Yeah. Okay, and then...
so what I would do, I wouldn't start here.
Yeah, maybe we can end here.
Yeah.
Maybe after we talk about the boat, we can connect the boat sculpture to the boat picture, which is actually the one I used to reference the sculpture for. But then this little cluster is just a parang random colonial photograph kind of collection. We can move on to here. These are actually photographs and original sheet music by the ethnomusicologist Dr. Felicidad Prudente.
And you're hearing the sounds from those field recordings.
Yeah, who did field work and recorded singing in 1973 to 1975 in Limay and Mariveles. This show does not present any like actual artifact borrowed from the community other than the sheet music, which is actually from 1973. So.
Yeah, so if anyone asks you, are these pictures from 1901? The answer is yes and no. They're reproductions. So, yeah.
This one, maybe just a little... Yeah, this is an interesting note. This is done in Paete, not in Las Casas, with a trusted carver, who I never asked to finish my work. So, like when I handed him a photograph of an Ayta mother and with two kids to carve out, This is what came out with heart earrings as his own personal interpretation, and I don't know what to make out of the face of the child. And this is the first time I'm having them finish the work, because I always have them roughly done. So they had passed it on to another guy who did the finishing. And this is done in batikuling wood, which is not pale. This is actually quite like a mid-tone wood kind of finish. So what they do with wood carved that has a lot of discoloration is they bleach it, so it's easier to tone it in a very uniform sense. So they had finished it as if they would finish santo, and the texture and the shine in it is reminiscent of a santo, but the figure is that of an Ayta, which is actually quite ironic. So when I saw it a few days ago to pick it up in Laguna, like I did not know what to expect, because it's not at all what I expected. But then like as I got into thinking, this is the perfect specimen of the colonial gaze passed on through local hands. Diba? So parang he was commissioned to do an image of an Ayta, but he did it like a santo. I don't know if that's an imposition of what he knows what to do, or that's his own initiative of like trying to beautify it or whatnot. So like
also, it's a very Christian practice, right, to create these images, to create these sculptures, the santos. So we have a funny anecdote, not directly related to it, but somewhat related. Our family has a Black Nazarene sculpture in the church in Bataan, which we then lent to the local town for the church to use, and they wanted to use it for a procession. So we lent it to them for a few weeks, or a few months, I think. It came back white. They painted the Black Nazarene white. So when it came back to us, we were really puzzled. Christina saw this. We were really puzzled because we didn't know like what to do afterwards. Like, you know, in the community paints like doesn't want a black Christ. And they want like a mestizo one, and then they bring it back to you. So anyway, very, very interesting when he told us his story, because it seems like it happens very often, and maybe it's something to do with Filipino craftsmanship and like Catholic traditions, and like our idea of what like our gods and saints look like.
I think one other point worth referencing is that when we look at the colonial gaze, the way women in the community are portrayed are either as objects, as you see in these colonial images, or as mother figures or saints, as you see here. But actually, when we had these meetings with the 18 communities, most of the chieftains were women. And they were very vocal, and they're very powerful parts of the community. So, you know, you see their voices through the counter-mapping exercises. And also, I think this agreement had a lot of female pushing in it as well. So, yeah. Timeline?
Yeah. One piece. I will. Take it.
It's super interesting.
That's so white Ayta. So this timeline is basically just a list or a compilation of dates I gathered throughout the research. It comes from different angles, from political, legal, to just ethnographic or land development, up to personal narratives, especially the ones in the near present. So it starts off with a little bit from Spanish colonial times, particularly in the church's attempts to relocate the Ayta communities within certain lands. Then if you see at some point there is a inauguration of Ayta town in Dinalupihan called Pasig. And then there's actually a land use plan attached to that document, which you can find in the Local History of Bataan book.
And one more thing is that this timeline is a great way to kind of contextualize all the literature. And the reason that we have these benches here is actually because people are meant to come, sit, read the literature, and spend time with it. So this is not kind of a fast walkthrough kind of show. It's something that if you really want to get it, you need to spend time. Okay, back to time.
Okay, so if you can see, you fast forward from 300 BC to early 1300s, just saying Bataan was part of the vast Kapampangan Empire. It once spoke Kapampangan, and then eventually became encroached within the jurisdiction of Cavite, I think, and then it became Tagalog rather than Kapampangan. And then, royal decrees from the Spanish, and then up to the early 20s, where they started having receiving presidential proclamations declaring certain sites as Negrito reservations. So these are actually inputs of the Balanga IPA, or the Indigenous Peoples Apostolate. It's a group within the church that helps out the communities. They also established the PANABAT, the Panlalawigan Association ng mga Ayta sa Bataan, and the dates are there. Yeah. So from presidential proclamations declaring reservations to the 90s up to the distant past, and then what they're sort of struggling to have passed now are CADTs, or Certificate of Ancestral Domain Title. So essentially, this whole narrative boils down to the struggle for land, tenureship, and self-determination. So there's a lot of legal elements within this timeline, other than the more personal narratives represented within the recent. So such as the only 2017 entry I had was 200 hectares of Dangkul was sold to Sally and Attorney Elia. Tapos wala man ng there's not even a last name in the entry, and that's a personal account. So as you can see, I was also interested in some items that showed, like I said, little pockets of resistance within their history. Like in 2008, when charcoal production was banned in Mariveles, Mariveles community marched to the municipio to demand compensation. And a few others. So any questions about the timeline? Because it's quite a read. I mean, it's like a bullet pointing. And
very important point for this timeline is that the community was involved in this timeline.
Yeah.
So yeah, their words are incorporated in here. So it's not Cian like speaking on behalf of, he's speaking with them.
Yeah.
Why did you make the martial law kind of just small? Is that not part with? Did that not really like?
Sorry, the martial law.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually looking for very particular martial law related incidents. Maybe I didn't dig deep enough. I was also torn between how to systematically represent all this information from various levels of information, from legal to personal to cultural or academic. So now it's all just in one.
And this is a dynamic timeline, so it's meant to change over time.
Yeah.
It's something that it's not static.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So these are also just a few clippings I found from Lopez Museum Library and Archives, which has some mention of Ayta Bataan. This is the iconic boxer codex, etc. And some illustrations as well. I guess it's also just visually important to representation drawn by hand alongside representation with the medium of photography. And then finally we end with this, wherein we had lent 4 disposable cameras to 4 communities, and then these are their photographs. There was very little instruction on what photographs to take, other than people and places and daily events. So important to note here, I think this is Pon Sonia, the mom of Anthony over there, and she wore costume at some point. Also important to see like how they sell their harvest in the public market. So I don't know, there could be many different readings, and
but they're again live people living their life. They're not specimens to be studied.
Yeah.
Like they're like us.
this is them with a little camera telling their story.
And I think the last thing to close the show, to close the tour, would also be to talk about the public program. So maybe you can talk a bit about the 2 main symposiums that you...
Okay, so within the duration of the exhibition, we will be having 2 public programs, one of which is about themes within Indigenous people's knowledge to Indigenous people's struggle, because the person we're asking to talk about Indigenous people's knowledge is like a package deal in herself, but I didn't want to talk about IP knowledge without talking about IP struggle. And in between, how they are represented in
Indigenous people.
yeah, and in between, how they are represented within the cultural scene, so cultural appropriation and reappropriation and adaptation. So the second roundtable we're having in January, I'm inviting some of the scholars who have contributed to the Ayta texts, who have integrated with the communities and working within various fields from ethnomedicine, ethnomusic, and a bunch of other, and linguistics and a bunch of other practices. So that will be like a presentation of papers and projects, and I will moderate that to sort of also see where we can all take these initiatives, which were may or may not be, or in different levels, left undone, because what is made in the academe more often than not stays within the academe, and this is also the same in what contemporary art is. What is made within contemporary art stays within the galleries and the museums and art history, but what is art history? And what who is art history? So what I kind of want to do is really bring it back to the grassroots.
And last thing, maybe you can tell us about the title and what inspired that?
Okay, so the title is Busis Ibat Ha Kanayunan, which is the Magbukun for Voices from the Hinterlands. So I was actually like having second thoughts on this title, because the use of hinterlands might have a lot of like very third worldly, savage connotation. Maybe, or even the word kanayunan within the Tagalog may actually have a lot of very sharp leftist connotations, which I didn't mind actually. But then, in terms of as far as translation goes, I think the idea of the mediation of voices coming from them, I just wanted to highlight that. As opposed to me speaking for them, this is me speaking with them.
I think that's a very key part of the show, and all walkthroughs should incorporate that.
Maybe we can show the last, just the document.
Okay, sige, sige.
That's the full document.
Okay. So one last little thing. So within my meetings with the communities, with sila Bukal, Dani, and others, we've been going back and forth trying to draft this document, which is actually a localized version of the FPIC, or the Free and Prior Informed Consent. This is a document by the NCIP, or the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, and then that document actually also has a fee, and that's NCIP giving you consent to talk to the communities, which we thought was not necessary in this particular project, because that's usually required from NGOs and big institutional or academic research. But for me, contemporary art, which is like the wild card in terms of community integration, we just drafted our own local version of FPIC. We didn't even call it an FPIC. It's just a kasulutan ng kahintulutan, or like a consent letter. So yeah, it's been a few drafts over and over, and then it's in Tagalog. So that's basically, it's saying na kami mga ako-anda, mga leader katutubo, like we the Aytas, are giving consent to Cian Dayrit and his research on the local history and culture of us. Nakikisa kami sa paninaliksik. We take part in his research and paglalaan ng panahon by giving time for the focus group discussions and participating in the mapping workshops. And then we also enumerated here some points that they felt that they are inaasahan namin, or we are counting on that Cian Dayrit gives us the images, maps, literature, writings, the timeline, and audio recordings, as well as documentation and the press release for the exhibition, among other things. And then, amin ding nananais na ilunsad ang naturang exhibition na we also want the exhibition to be remounted within the communities of Bataan, with the communities, so that people, Aytas and non-Aytas, would see it. Yeah, okay. And then, sa pagkakataon ng mga benta, okay. And then if there is any sale, we will talk about it further. Yeah. And then, maliban dito, bukas kami sa pagpatuloy. And then, we are also parang looking forward to sit down and talk about having more workshops among interested members and to do other cultural projects that will spread awareness and consciousness about the culture and history of the Aytas, like children's books or documentaries or ethno-music records or workshops and performances. And to eventually, hopefully, mount a museum and library and resource center for the Aytas, managed by the Aytas, with my work as an initial content of this space. I think that's one of the most important points, that it is managed by themselves, not through me, not through a curator, not through NCIP or NCCA or any other, but that they should have like a very solid voice within this resource center.
I think what I love about this document, as like that final, like that last thing, is it really embodies the process in which Cian worked throughout this entire show. The idea that it was consultative, it was drafted, redrafted, like, you know, consulted, like back and forth. So, you know, with all these questions about cultural appropriation, how to approach like culture that is not yours, it's I think one of the things that we have to consider is the process in which it's done. And you can tell usually when it's rushed or when it wasn't consulted with the communities. Right?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Hope you guys can relay this to us.